This is the Heartland Daily Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Heartland Institute's Daily Podcast. I'm Sterling Burnett, Heartland Research Fellow and Managing Editor of Environment and Climate News. I'm pleased to have as a guest today Lord Christopher Monckton. Lord Monckton was the advisor that first brought the issue of global warming to the attention of then Prime Minister Lady Margaret Thatcher. Over time, Lord Monckton's research has led him to be one of the most prominent and visible skeptics, or as I like to refer to our little but growing group, climate realist. Lord Monckton is here with us today to discuss a recent paper he wrote on the now thoroughly debunked claims made that 2014 was the hottest year on record, and a paper he co-authored in the journal Science Bulletin, which demonstrates the superiority of a simpler climate model he and several colleagues developed when compared to the dozens of complex models used by the IPCC. Lord Monckton, thanks for being with us today.
It's a real pleasure, Sterling.
Tell us, Lord Monckton, a little bit about yourself, how you became engaged in the climate war that we find ourselves in.
A finance house chief executive from London rang me in the Highlands one day, and he said, could I please look at this question, because he wasn't sure what to make of it. This was about 2006. So I said to him, well, as far as I know, there's a problem. I flagged it up when I was at the policy unit in number 10, 20 years previously. But then when I had a look at the science, again, I found that things had moved on since I last looked at it. It was now quite clear that there wasn't the problem they had tried to make out, and that instead a lot of people were making a lot of money pretending that a non-problem was a crisis. And so that's how I got into it. I wrote a piece in the end for the Sunday Telegraph, which got, I think it was 127,000 hits in 2 hours to the Telegraph's website in 2006, and that crashed the website for the only time in the Telegraph's history. It's the most popular article they have ever printed, because people were fascinated to hear that there were serious arguments on the other side of the story. And of course, from then on, once I'd gone public and I'd said, right, there is another side to the story, I was a marked man as far as the climate Comintern were concerned. And I then became the target of the usual vile campaign of personal attacks, which anyone who dares to raise questions on this subject is faced with.
Lord Monckton, in light of how the various scientific bodies have been forced to retract their early claims, I mean, the day had barely dawned on 2015, and all of a sudden they were announcing 2014 was the warmest year on record. Why do you think they even made the initial claims, since they knew them to be wrong? And how do you think the brouhaha sort of reflects the current state of climate science and the climate debate?
Well, the first thing is it's very, very clear that there's been a long history of tampering with the temperature records, and nearly always it's so as to suppress or push down temperatures in the early part of the 20th century and raise them in the later part and the beginning of the 21st century, so as to make it look as though there was more warming in the 20th century than in fact there was. On top of that, the figures that they issue don't always come with the uncertainties attached. And this is where they went wrong. On, I think, 2 of the 5 principal data sets, it looked as though 2014 might have been the warmest of all the years since they began measuring, which goes back to 1850, which doesn't amount to much. After all, if you have been recovering from the Little Ice Age, as the world has been doing for the last 300 years, where would you expect the hottest temperatures to come after 300 years of warming? They will, of course, be at the end of the record. So it's not as though this is anything terribly surprising. We're only talking of tiny fractions of 100th of a degree anyway. But in fact, what they'd left out was these measurement and coverage and bias uncertainties. Now, the measurement uncertainty is simply that we don't know how accurate each of the measuring stations, particularly terrestrial ones, are. Similar uncertainties apply to, slightly less bad to the satellites because of things like orbital degradation and failures in the microwave sensors. So there is uncertainties in whether we're measuring things straight. Then there are what are called the coverage uncertainties that apply, again, chiefly to the terrestrial data sets because they don't have uniform coverage measuring all the different places on the globe. particularly in places like the Arctic and the Antarctic, there's an enormous amount of extrapolation, as there is right across Russia, China, and other areas where they haven't yet got a well-developed temperature network. So these measurement and coverage uncertainties are joined by a third uncertainty known as the bias uncertainty, which means that there may be, because of all the other uncertainties, systematic bias in one direction or other in the measurements. Now, the only organization which does global measurements and also publishes every month the combined measurement coverage and bias uncertainties is Hadcroot 4. And what that shows is that these uncertainties amount to a 1/6 of a Celsius degree. So if somebody comes along and says, well, by 100th of a Celsius degree or a 50th of a Celsius degree, this was the warmest year ever, they're well within the error margin, which is a 1/6 of a Celsius degree. So the answer is we don't know whether it was the warmest ever. And certainly on the 2 satellite records, it wasn't the warmest weather, nor on Hadcroot itself. Only on the 2 American records, which have been notoriously and very frequently and very seriously tampered with to a degree that hasn't been attempted on any of the other records.
Well, of course.
Well, you did ask.
Yeah. No, well, of course, even the American ones, people like Gavin Schmidt had to come out and say, sorry, I know we claimed it was the warmest year on record, but there's only like a 32% chance.
Yeah, 38% on his record, and I think 48% on another. The fact is, they don't really know that it was the warmest year. We don't have accurate enough measurements. They're desperate. They were desperate to say that it was the warmest year. And the reason, of course, was that there is this very big climate conference coming up, which is run by the UN, the 23rd, I think it is, in the series, annual conference in Paris in December this year. It was in Lima last year, and it was somewhere else before that. They've been doing it for years. And this one is going to be the big enchilada. This is where they're going to try to get the sort of Paris World Government Treaty to make countries agree to sign away their sovereignty to the UN in the name of saving the planet from what is turning out on the temperature record to be a non-problem. You see, the important thing is not so much whether by some tiny fraction of a degree the weather is warmer than it was in the last few years. The real question is, how is the temperature changing in respect of the long-run forecast? And if we go back to 1990, the UN's climate panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, made its first big multi-thousand leaden page report on the climate at that time. And it said at the beginning, we predict, and it said that for the next 35 years, up until 2025, they expected to see 1 Celsius degree of warming. Now, if you do a kind of straight line projection since then, since 1990, you would expect just over 2/3 of a Celsius degree to have happened by now. And in fact, just under 1/3 of a Celsius degree has happened. So the rate, the world has been warming a little, but only at half the rate that was then predicted. And of course, the forces of darkness, if you point this out, they said, well, those were the early models. Yes, but they said that those models were with substantial confidence. That was the words they used in the IPCC report in 1990, capturing the major features of the climate. And after all, since the whole debate was about how much the temperature was going to change, that was clearly one of the features of the climate they ought to have been expected to be able to capture with confidence. But of course, they couldn't. They got it wrong. And the UN has now drastically had to cut back its forecasts in the near term of how much warming we're likely to see. But curiously, they have not also made adjustments to their longer-term forecasts, because otherwise they wouldn't have a scary story still to tell. So they made major adjustments as a result of expert reviewers like me getting at them between the first and the final draft of the 2013 fifth assessment report. But they left the long-term forecast. They're still saying, well, we're expecting 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, and therefore 3, 4, 5, 6 Celsius of warming by the end of the 21st century. Well, frankly, these forecasts are now more or less known to be entirely outrageously out of kilter with reality, and the world simply hasn't been warming now for 30 years at anything like the rate that, say, James Hansen predicted in 1988. It is getting on for 30 years since he made that forecast. And it's just, in fact, there hasn't been so hot a June day in Washington as the day in 1988 on which he made that forecast, when Senator Tim Wirth, acting with Al Gore, had managed to arrange for the air conditioning in the hearing room to be turned off, so that the senators would feel the heat and throw lots of money at making this non-problem go away.
Yeah, well, that's just another manipulation that we can attribute to climate alarmists. It just amazes me, though, I've got to say, it just amazes me that, they issue these pronouncements, the press covers it, front page stuff, and then within days they have to retract their statements or modify their statements.
And that doesn't make the front page, of course. And this is how they work. Constant overstatements, which are then published, followed by retractions, which are not published. And that's how they keep the scare going. It's one of many highly sophisticated, highly dishonest spin techniques that are used by the lavishly funded green groups. And, of course, governments are throwing enormous amounts of money at these green groups, too. They shouldn't do, but they do. And, in effect, they've created a new far-left political monster. The curious thing to me about this debate is that it is the far left that have picked up this climate thing and run with it. The Republicans in the United States, for instance, have really quite early on, they realized they'd been had. They realized the scientists had overdone it. They had people like me testifying in front of Congress several times and just saying, look, here's what the temperature records show, here's what they predicted, look at the difference between the two. And these pieces of real-world evidence were enough to convince any reasonable, independent-minded person that maybe we don't have a problem after all. And yet, the left have decided, clearly for political reasons, that they wish to push this. It is a left-wing agenda. You heard it all through the State of the Union address, as though there weren't more serious problems at the moment for the world to face than climate change. But nevertheless, Mr. Obama singled this out. Now, why have they done this? Why have they gone nap for this? Well, there are two reasons. One, I think, is national and one is international. The national reason is that it is largely the fossil fuel companies that were the big funders of the Republican Party. So if you destroy the oil companies and the coal companies and you wreck their revenue base, then that reduces the amount of money available to your Republican opponents. And one should never underestimate the willingness of the left to set national policy purely for the sake of their own partisan political advantage. So that's the national one. Internationally, of course, the Socialist International, the idea that there should be a single communist world government, this has long been the ambition of the far left, and it still is. Just because the Berlin Wall came down, they didn't all say, okay, it's a fair cop, we'll go and do something else. They piled into the Green Movement instead and said, right, we'll set up a world government on the basis of getting up a climate scare. We'll get the various bureaucracies and politicians to sign up to this. And you may think that your constitution will protect you from this because you are, I think, just about the only country in the world where the executive branch cannot ratify a treaty of its own initiative. It has to go to the Senate for a two-thirds majority. But you see, the way the left work is, even if they can't push the treaty through in Paris straight away, as far as America is concerned, all the other nations can sign up because their governments will robotically go along with the left on this. But of course the Senate, as at present constituted, won't. But this is where the left play the long game. They simply wait. And they know that eventually they'll get enough Democrats in the Senate, in the usual political cycle, that they'll be able to force through the signing up to that treaty. And that is why the most important thing that we should all press for now, when it comes to trying to stop the Paris agenda, is to make sure that there is, in the climate treaty there, the same get-out clause that was written into the Kyoto Protocol, which says that if after 6 months any nation gives 6-month notice, it is allowed to leave all its obligations under that treaty without having to ask all the other members to consent. Now, this is very important. I'll tell you why. Here I am in Edinburgh, and in Britain, we made the mistake of signing up to the European treaties that now transfer our legislative power to unelected bureaucrats overseas without putting in a get-out clause. which means that even if the British, in a referendum, which I think we're going to get in 2020 on this issue, vote to come out of that treaty, there will be years of unscrambling and haggling before the will of the people is eventually acceded to, because no provision for secession was written into the treaties. Quite deliberately, they did this so that nobody could get out, that they would create this new bureaucratic dictatorship, and nobody could escape. Now, the UN is being advised by the EU on this. I saw several EU advisors at the Cancun Climate Conference, and I watched them murmuring and whispering into the ears of the UN, saying, this is how we grabbed power, now you can do the same. And they are going to try, if they can, to get a binding treaty with no secession clause, as it's called, no right of the state parties to the treaty to leave without permission simply on giving notice. So the most crucial thing that you must press your congressmen and senators for, and press your government for, if possible, is that they should make sure that there is that get-out clause, that escape route. Now, why is it important in this particular treaty that there should be an escape route? The reason in particular is that it is already apparent to thee and me, Sterling, that there isn't a problem with the climate. I mean, the climate is always a problem, but we are not adding to that. If anything, outside the tropics, we're probably reducing it, and inside the tropics, the jury is still out. Because as the world gets warmer, you actually get less violent storms, less of the floods and droughts we've been seeing. They are on the decline. But the point is that it is gradually going to become apparent to more and more people that this particular scare has been oversold. And eventually, even the classe politique, even the bureaucrats, even the governments of the world, who are, of course, instinctively on what the Chinese would have called the legalist or totalitarian side of things. Government is force, as Tony Blair used to say. Even they, who would love to have a world government so they can stop being Prime Minister of Britain or President of the United States and go off and be President of the world instead. Those who are ambitious love the idea of a world government. But even they are eventually going to realize that in transferring their national power and sovereignty to some alien overseas dictatorship, they're also transferring enormous amounts of wealth, and this will be as much resented worldwide if the UN gets that power and wealth, as it is already resented throughout the European Union by the people of the member states who are fed up with being governed by an unelected tyranny by clerk. And so the same thing is going to happen, and eventually people in government will realize this, and then they will start looking at those treaties and say, how can we get out of this? It's plain that there isn't, after all, the problem that we all thought there was in 2015, so now how do we get out of it? And if that escape clause is in there, as it was in the Kyoto Protocol, then they can leave very easily, and the teeth of the damage are drawn. This is also a reasonable proposal, because if the other side say, but suppose there is a climate crisis, well, in that case, everybody will have signed up to this treaty, and they'll stay signed up to it because they'll all see there really is a crisis. But if there isn't one, then there is the freedom for countries to leave. And if that freedom is guaranteed, then I think that this treaty process will basically, although it's been very, very expensive for the world, apart from that, it will prove, in political terms, harmless.
Well, you've given our listeners a lot to think about, Lord Monckton. I'd like to move a little bit beyond sort of the politics and go in particular to some stuff you've been working on recently. Please tell us about your recent paper, Why Models Run Hot, Results from the Irreducibly Simple Climate Model, which was in Science Bulletin, a prominent Chinese science journal. What was the inspiration for it, and what did you and your co-authors discover?
Well, now, first of all, I should say who my distinguished co-authors are. Dr. Willie Soon of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, who's been there for decades, knows more about the sun and its influence on climate than anybody else alive. Professor David Lee Gates, who's the professor of geography and hydroclimatology at the University of Delaware. And Matt Briggs, very important part of the mix because he's a statistician. And as you will have seen it with things like the mistake that led to the hockey stick graph that pretended falsely to abolish the medieval warm period, that arose because of several elementary misunderstandings as to how statistics operate. So I felt it was important to have a solar physicist, to have a professor of geography and hydroclimatology, and also to have a statistician. So those were my three co-authors. And the task that we set ourselves, I mean, I produced the first draft and then they all bashed it around and knocked it into shape, was to try to boil down the question of how much global warming we're going to get into a simple model that doesn't tell you exactly how rainfall is going to change in the Peruvian Andes and so forth. All it does tell you is, given a given amount of extra CO2 in the atmosphere, how much warmer will the weather eventually get, and how quickly will it get that warm? That was the question we set ourselves. Can we really boil it down to a very, very simple model? And we found by, struggling with the math that we thought we could do this. So we wrote a heavily mathematical paper in which we set all this out. And then we thought we'd better run this model to see whether it was useful as a way of not replacing, of course, the far bigger models that can tell you, whether it's going to rain on the Grand National Racecourse in 3 years' time. And we don't claim to be able to do that. We are much more broad-brush and focused only on this question of what is called climate sensitivity, which is how much warming will you get if you double the CO2 in the atmosphere. And we found that using our model, you could at once see a number of rather spooky mistakes that were being made by the bigger models. One of these mistakes was actually quite elementary. The UN's climate panel had realized that its original estimates of things called temperature feedbacks, which are ways in which the climate changes just because it's got warmer as a result of, say, CO2, and then these changes cause further warming. That's the official storyline anyway. Now, we found that the IPCC had quietly reduced its central estimates of all these feedbacks by so much that they should have reduced their central estimate of how much global warming there was going to be just on that count alone, from around 3.5 Celsius to around 2 Celsius. This is quite a big reduction that they somehow failed to make. They only made the reduction in the short-term forecasts and not, as we said earlier, in the long-term ones. We also found that in order to continue to try to get away with saying there's a climate problem, they had used in the central equation a process or equation taken from electronic circuitry that doesn't belong in the climate. This is known as the Bode system gain equation. What it does is it allows the climate modelers to find an excuse to multiply by 3 the very small direct warming of probably 1 Celsius degree per doubling of CO2 that you and I might expect, and suddenly it becomes 3, 5, or even 10 Celsius per doubling. Well, these absurdly high forecasts arise from the misapplication in the climate of an equation which belongs in a class of dynamical objects such as electronic circuits for which it was originally derived, but it doesn't belong in dynamical systems such as the climate. There are a couple of very key points about the climate system that mean you can't apply the Bode equation to it at all, particularly if you're imagining that, as the IPCC does try to imagine, that the feedbacks are strongly net positive. There are technical reasons why that equation doesn't apply. For one thing, in an electronic circuit, the output is voltage. It doesn't matter how much the voltage changes, that does not help to equilibrate the system. In the climate, the output is temperature, and that is the instrument by which a radiative imbalance caused by, say, our adding CO2 to the atmosphere is resolved. The temperature goes up to make sure that the radiation going out from the Earth balances the radiation coming in. It's pretty elementary stuff. The Bode equation doesn't model systems of that class. And so this is quite a big mistake. And in fact, we are not the only ones to have spotted this. I was giving a talk 3 years ago to a learned society somewhere in Europe. I have to be rather vague about who and where it was for various reasons. But at that society, I raised this issue. And a learned professor who's one of the top 6 experts on the application of feedbacks to the climate in the world, has written dozens of extremely highbrow papers on this, which are well above my pay grade even to read, let alone to understand. He was on the other side in the debate. And afterwards, he wrote to me and said, actually, I take your point about the Bode equation. I have already referred to the fact there may be problems with this in one of my papers, which he then kindly sent me. And I'm going to do further work on this as a result of what you showed me, because he'd never seen the equation plotted beyond what's called a loop gain of unity. And when he saw that, he was rather horrified. He has now done his work on it. It took him 3 years, and he's written a very important paper which is now going through peer review. And I've been begged not to tell you who he is, because if the forces of darkness knew that I had talked to him about this, and that he had got this idea, at least in part, from that debate with me, of course they would be sneering and furious, and they would say that he was a traitor to the true belief that he's held until now. But his conclusion in this paper, which he has let me know, is that, just as ours is, that maybe you could push climate sensitivity up to 1 Celsius per doubling if you tried, but he thinks it's more likely to be less, and perhaps quite a lot less even than that. And he is somebody who is right in the mainstream of the true believing scientists. He, as a result of thinking about this equation and thinking about feedbacks, has come to the conclusion that the climate sensitivity figure that is right at the heart of the UN's process simply isn't real. So this is a very big deal, and we were the first to flag this up very explicitly, which we've done in our paper for the Chinese Science Bulletin. And of course, this is why we are now facing the most savage attacks from the usual suspects. I mean, within a day of the Daily Mail picking it up and running a wonderful piece which reported very faithfully what was in it in a perfectly straight and neutral way. A Greenpeace front organization had rung round various Insta-quote rent by the hour scientists to get quotes about how dreadful this paper was, and many of them were incautious enough to make statements about it which made it absolutely plain that they hadn't read it. Indeed, one of them hadn't even read the IPCC's documents at all, because he misquoted them as well. So we were able to dismiss these attacks very rapidly, whereupon they changed tack, and the next thing they tried was to write to the journal itself, saying, oh, Willie Soon has a conflict of interest because he's taken money in the past from fossil fuel companies. Well, so he has, to do various forms of research, all of which were approved by specific grants paid to his institution so that they can pay him to do the work. All of these grants are disclosed, they're a matter of public record, and there was nothing further for him to disclose because none of those grants related to this paper, and none of us received any payment for it at all. But clearly, the international well-funded organization that tried to shoot down every piece of serious research that suggests there might not be a problem with the climate, they went into overdrive over our paper. And that suggests they realize there is something fundamental in that paper that they know is ultimately going to prove fatal to the entire project. And that therefore they're doing their best to keep things spinning along until they get their wretched world government treaty in Paris. And therefore they'll be shouting and screaming about how terrible we are until then. But the scientific attacks that I've seen so far on this have been feeble in the extreme. And I don't think there's particularly anything very much wrong with this. The main virtue of this paper is that for the first time it condenses all the main points of what are the big influences on climate sensitivity into one paper, so that an undergraduate who knows a bit of physics and has a pocket calculator can actually reach reasonably credible estimates of climate sensitivity by using the simple considerations and discussions of all the parameters that we have laid out in our paper. It is effectively the manual for a model which allows anyone who is sufficiently diligent to work out his own estimates of climate sensitivity. And when we ran the model with parameters that we thought were physically justified and sensible, we didn't pick them to produce any particular result, we just chose parameters that for various reasons we thought were right. Some of them are the values that the IPCC itself uses, some of them are slightly different. We ran our model and we found that if you cast it back to the rate of warming that's been observed over the last 50 years or so, then our model is predicting warming at that sort of rate and is not predicting 3 or 4 times that warming. So it does look as though it's performing rather better than the official big models are, but of course only time will tell whether this is accident, because we're only looking at 50 years of data so far. Ideally we're going to have to wait till the end of the century to see who was right.
Well, unfortunately for us, the the true believers in anthropogenic global warming theory don't want to wait for 50 years to see the truth. They're of course clamoring under the precautionary principle to act now. And
let's talk very briefly about that, if I may. The precautionary principle is not a principle at all. It's an expedient allowing the left to argue for anything that they want for which there's no scientific justification. They say at whatever cost, we have to save the planet. I remember having this out with Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner many years ago when I first went into Congress and started rootling about there to find out what the Republicans were going to do. I spoke to one or two Blue Dog Democrats as well while I was there. And I remember Sensenbrenner saying, oh, the science is all too difficult. We can't argue with them on that, but we can argue with them on the economics. And I said to him, all they have to say is the two words precautionary principle. All they have to say is it doesn't matter what the cost, we have to save the planet, which is otherwise doomed. And if you haven't done the science, you can't show that it isn't doomed. And he stopped and thought for a moment. And he said, oh, you're right. And that was one of three moments at which the Republicans turned. He's a very influential congressman. As you know, he has the largest majority in Congress. He was, for a time, the co-chair of the Science, Global Warming Committee that I think they had when it was still run by the Democrats. And so he was one. Another of my favorite moments where you could see them changing their minds almost as they went on this question of should the Republicans fight the left on the science was when I was about to give testimony to one of these committees, and Congressman John Linder, now retired, was the Republican ranking member on the Energy and Climate Committee of the House, and at that time it was still under Democratic control. And he said, could I do a quick 5-minute run-through for his boys before we went into the main hearing room? So I did that. And I showed a graph that I'd found in the IPCC's 2007 report, which showed the temperature record of the Earth from Hadkrut since 1850, with 4 trend lines superimposed on it, and each trend line started closer to the present than the last, and the more recent ones had the steepest slopes. And from this, the entirely statistically unjustifiable conclusion was drawn that the rate of warming had accelerated because of global warming, and it was all our fault, and this was going to get worse. And they said this twice, and they used the graph twice in the document. And before I had even started to explain why this graph was wrong, John Linder took one look at it, and he said, they can't have done that. He said, gentlemen, we need hear nothing further from Lord Monckton before we go straight into the meeting. It is quite clear that an organization, the IPCC, that can produce a graph as stupid and dishonest as this one is not meritorious. We need not pay any attention at all, ever again, to anything that it says. And that was very interesting because they all then, of course, afterwards said, well, can you explain what this was? John Linder had got it in a flash. He was very, very quick. And they had not realized that there were 2 previous periods on the same graph of the same length as the period which they said was the one of the steepest warming, which was from 25 years ago till now, roughly, which had the same slope, 1860 to 1880 and 1910 to 1940. I had noticed this in my own temperature analyses and had arranged for a colleague who has a seat in the House of Lords, which I don't, to put down a question saying, is this the case? And through gritted teeth, the then minister had to reply that, yes, it was the case. There were 3 periods of exactly the same rate of warming that have appeared in the last 150 years, 1860 to 1880, 1910 to 1940, and 1976 to 2001. And there's nothing much to tell statistically between the 3 rates of warming. There hasn't been any acceleration. And, of course, as you may know, now if you go back for the last 18 years and 2 months on the RSS satellite record, which is, and they're all statistically within range of each other, that shows no global warming at all for getting on for 2 decades.
Right. Yeah. And the precautionary principle, as you say, is something they trot out. In America, I can't speak, of course, for the UK, but in America, the other thing they trot out when they want government action, regardless of the cost, is the children. And so you hear the two. It's oh, well, how many children are you going to kill? It's for the children, and immediately everyone's supposed to...
Oh, yes, you get all this emotional guff. But the best answer to this is to say, all right then, let us do a standard intertemporal economic appraisal of 2 scenarios. One, we take action now in the way that the left wants us to spend trillions immediately on making this non-problem go away, and we know what that's going to cost because they're telling us what they want to do and how much they want us to spend. The UN is saying we've got to spend at least $1 billion a day or whatever it is. We know what they want us to spend, so we can say, right, that's what you want to spend. How much global warming will that spending make to go away? And if we didn't do that, and instead we allowed the warming to carry on at the rate that you predict, then would it be worthwhile to simply let that warming occur and pay the much later cost of adapting to it, providing it's also a lesser cost? That's the economic question that should be and should have been asked in this debate, and it virtually hasn't been. There's very little economic literature on the question of whether climate mitigation makes sense. And such as there is, none until I came along and actually did this for the World Federation of Scientists in 2011, had ever married the official equations of how you determine climate sensitivity with the standard techniques of intertemporal economic appraisal to find out whether it was worthwhile to make global warming go away today, or better to let it happen. What has the least what's called unit mitigation cost? And the answer is that it's actually between 10 and 100 times more expensive to act today, according to the so-called precautionary principle, to make global warming go away than to let it happen and pay the far lesser cost of adapting to such of its consequences as they tell us will be net adverse. And of course, as you know, they're probably wrong even in that. So it's 100 times more expensive. In fact, the most spectacular example we found of this was the British government's subsidies to electric vehicles, which are $8,350 per vehicle, plus a total remission of the annual vehicle tax. And if you add that all up, and you were to use measures of equivalent unit mitigation cost to try to make global warming go away worldwide, then 3/4 of global GDP would be consumed in just preventing global warming from happening. And this would be 128 times more expensive than letting the warming happen at the rate they predict and simply adapting to it.
Hello, and welcome to the Heartland Institute's Daily Podcast. I'm Sterling Burnett, Heartland Research Fellow and Managing Editor of Environment and Climate News. I'm pleased to have with us again today Lord Christopher Monckton. He continues his discussion of climate research that he has done, climate models that he's worked on, and the sort of political response, the political reaction both to his work and really sort of looking forward, what we should be doing. What's the smart climate policy? What we should be taking, how much should we be taking seriously the science of anthropogenic global warming theorists, and what our responses should be both now in order to make the future a better place and now the best it can be. Well, Lord Monckton, thanks for being with us today.
It's very good to be back, and I must say, Sterling, I'm enjoying this very much. And you ask, of course, a very sensible question. What, if anything, should we do? Politicians always think you have to do stuff, and sometimes you have to know when not to do stuff. And this is one of those times. There is no need to do anything at all about global warming for many reasons. First of all, it isn't happening at anything like the rate they predicted. In the last 18 years and more, it hasn't happened at all. Secondly, it isn't going to happen at anything like the rate they predicted. And thirdly, even if it were to happen at the rate they predicted, it would still be economically between 10 and 100 times cheaper to adapt to it later than to try to stop it now with the very expensive and industrially destructive policies which are being advocated usually by the far left environmental groups. So the correct answer, as far as policy is concerned, is to do nothing. But there are one or two things that need to be done in light of the fact that this scare got running before the political class woke up to the fact that they had been exploited by a surprisingly small proportion of the scientific community that saw the opportunity to get fat grants by whipping up a scare. And we are going to need a system of independent scientific review so as not to allow the hothouse atmosphere of politics to come together and say, right, we can use this as a way of further exploiting the people with extra taxation and regulation. We're plainly going to have to learn the lessons of this very, very expensive mistake that was made in accepting the science of the far left. It should never have been accepted. Gradually, this is becoming realized, at least by those who are not making enormous profits by having their snouts in this particular very well-supplied trough. So the first thing is we don't need to do anything about the climate except keep our usual fatherly eye on it. And obviously this means we keep an eye, among other things, on whether the temperature change does start to accelerate to anything like the rate which the usual suspects have predicted. I don't see it doing that, but it may. And if it does, we will have plenty of time to adapt to it. See, the previous story was, oh no, we've got to do everything now, we've got to save the planet, it's 10 years, or it's 8 years, or it's 5 years, or it's 14 years, or it's 20 years, and if we don't act within that time, then we're doomed. Actually, thanks to the fact there hasn't been any global warming at all for 18 years, we are not any longer under any pressure. We're not in a hurry. If this is a very slow fuse, it isn't a problem. This is something that's not well understood. The longer it takes for the global warming to appear, the less severe it will be, because everybody will have masses and masses of time to adapt to it. You hear all these hard luck stories about species having to move further north because they're having to adapt to global warming. Hey, there are some parts of the Earth where the temperature between midday and midnight can be 100 degrees Fahrenheit apart. And the creatures that live on this Earth have had to be able to adapt to quite a wide range of temperatures. So there isn't actually any problem with us or our fellow creatures or even plants adapting to changing temperatures in whichever direction they may change. After all, we've just come through 4 major ice ages in the last 400 years, 8 in the last 800,000 years. These things come and go over the hundreds of thousands of years, and this is not a problem. We are able to adapt as are all other species on Earth, even to quite big extremes. But which way is that going to go next? We are now in what is called an interglacial warm period. In fact, it's less warm than each of the 4 previous interglacial warm periods by 1 or 2 degrees. It's actually quite a lot less warm. And the danger is that unless it catches up to those other warm periods, which were also mostly shorter in duration than this one, then the next thing that's going to happen to us as the planet wheels around the sun in its orbit and the various Milankovitch cycles of orbital change exercise their influence in changing the climate, the next thing we're likely to be headed for, and I can't say it's going to happen next year or the next 1,000 years, but by the next 5,000 years I would have expected it to happen. The next thing that is going to happen is an ice age. We'll be back in the ice age. The more CO2 we can put in the atmosphere between now and when that happens, the better, because it'll help to stave off, perhaps for a few hundred years, the return of the next ice age. And that really will, when that ice age comes, that will kill a lot of people. It's much, much harder to adapt to increasing cold than it is to adapt to increasing warmth. Why is it, after all, if you look at these things in a very straightforward way that the press are sort of militantly not doing at the moment? They keep on whittering on about how the ice in the Arctic is melting. They're, of course, very quiet about the ice in the Antarctic, which is spreading so fast that the combined total of ice in the world actually reached a satellite era record high just towards the end of last year. You won't see that reported in most of the mainstream news media, of course. But they faff on about how, oh, look at all these changes happening and the ice melting and so forth, without realizing how small these changes really are. And so we don't have to worry. We don't have to do anything about the climate except keep a fatherly eye. Hey, if the ice in the Arctic melts, this is splendid. We'll be able to get all sorts of oil and gas and things out of the Arctic, which will be very useful to us. This is not a problem. Or if you like, it's what's called a quality problem. We can take more advantage of it than any cost that we might have to endure. Oh, but what about the cuddly polar bears? Well, they came from the land in the first place about 200,000 years ago. It became too cold for them to live in places like Canada and Siberia. They were brown bears, and they adapted. they became albino, and they moved further north onto the ice, and they learned to feed off seal blubber, and those became the polar bears. They'll simply go back to the land and become brown bears again if it gets warm enough for them to do that. This is not the end of the world even for that species. And besides, 1% of the species that live on Earth live at the poles. 90% live in the tropics. Go figure. Warmer and wetter, not colder and drier, is best for life on Earth. And if the world gets warmer, this is not going to lead to extinctions. On the contrary, it's going to lead to an increase in speciation, which is observable every time and everywhere that the world gets warmer and wetter.
As I like to point out to my friends, it's no coincidence that when people retire, they don't move to Minnesota, they move to Florida.
It's funny that we get very few people retiring to Scotland from England. Quite a few retire to England from Scotland, and quite a few from England will go further south to Madeira or to the south of France. Why do they do this? Because they're closer to the sun that way. I spent 8 years in Cyprus when I was too sick to endure the British climate. I didn't move to the North Pole. I moved to Cyprus where it was hot, and I was able to endure it. Indeed, it saved my life. Now I'm fine. I can be back here in Scotland again, but for a time I couldn't. The warmer places are, of course, the places people want to go. And what I think is really extraordinary about this whole debate is that really obvious points like that warmer is better, that the earlier warm periods, and after all but 3% of the years since the end of the last big ice age 11,400 years ago have been warmer than the present. The fact is that warm is a very good thing. It's a beneficial thing. It's what helps to foster and create life and not to kill it. So the idea that any change in whichever direction from today's temperature is somehow wrong. The idea that, as Candide used to say it in Voltaire's great work of that name, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. No, that ain't the case. Actually, a warmer climate than today would be a much better climate than today almost everywhere. And the only reason, really, why they say that it wouldn't be is that sea level would rise. But the thing is, I don't know whether you've ever seen how big the ocean is. I'm going to give you some idea of how big it is, not by telling you how many billions of square miles. But the best way to tell you is that when we try to measure its temperature, we have 3,500 separate buoys which float around the oceans, and they're automated buoys, they're bathythermographs. They go down to a depth of about 2,000 feet and come back up again, and then they send a burst of information to a satellite, and they go down and do it again until they get beached somewhere, or they fail, or a shark swallows them, or whatever. But the basic principle, we've got 3,500 of these, and you think, therefore, we must have a very accurate idea of how the ocean temperature is changing. Well, interestingly, we don't. And the reason why is that even though this is the best network, or the least bad, the least ill-resolved network of temperature monitoring stations for the ocean that we've ever had, it still means that each of these gadgets has to monitor, get this, 300 million cubic kilometers of water. And how are you going to expect one of these little things to get an accurate picture of that? It's like trying to take a temperature and salinity profile of the whole of Lake Superior with one of these gadgets less than once a year and expecting you're going to get an accurate record. Of course, you're not. The ocean is huge, and because it's huge, it has an enormous heat capacity. In other words, it is a heat sink. Just like if you look inside your computer and you see the computer chip there, instead of being a wafer of silicon, it's a great big bulky thing with metal fins on it. That actually is the heat sink, which takes away the heat from the circuit to keep it cool enough to operate in a reasonably efficient way. And the ocean is a big heat sink. And there's another big heat sink. It's called outer space. And the atmosphere, which is the thing that's supposed to be getting warmer, is sandwiched between these two gigantic, near-infinite heat sinks. I mean, the outer space is pretty much an infinite heat sink, and the ocean is very nearly an infinite heat sink with respect to the atmosphere, because the atmosphere is nothing like as dense as the ocean. The ocean is 1,000 times denser than the atmosphere. So tiny changes in the atmospheric temperature will get taken up by the ocean, which simply won't notice. And in fact, the way one can expose this, and this is something that you should really do every quarter when the NOAA produces its graph of how the ocean temperatures are warming even though the air temperature isn't. The thing to do is to remember that graph of what they called ocean heat content, and it shows zetajoules of heat going into the ocean, these enormous figures. What you do is to convert it back to the temperatures which were originally measured by these 3,500 buoys. They didn't measure ocean heat content, they measured the temperature of the water. So why is it converted to ocean heat content, do you think? Well, there's only one reason for that change in units. It's a pretty straightforward calculation, actually, but until I sat down and did it, nobody had. What you do is you convert it back to temperature, and you find that the rate of ocean warming shown in the NOAA's graph, and this is where the warming is still going on, the rate is equivalent to half a Celsius degree every 100 years. That is all. And that's in the ocean. So that's probably, if you like, the worst we might face. That's the underlying rate of warming. Now allow for a bit of acceleration above that, because China, India, Brazil, all the big emerging countries, they're going to be emitting a lot more CO2 from fossil fuels over the next 100 years, come what may, as far as these agreements in Lima and Paris are concerned. So we're going to see, I think, more CO2 into the atmosphere, and that is going to cause some warming, which is why I would expect to see an acceleration from the kind of half a Celsius per century equivalent underlying rate of warming, which we can see in the oceans, to maybe somewhere towards 1 Celsius over the century. And it's not going to go much beyond that, because there comes a point where you run out of affordably extractable fossil fuels, and you either have to find some other ways of generating power or go without. And we're getting quite near the point where it's going to become much more expensive to extract oil from places like the North Sea. Yes, we keep on finding new reserves. Now we've got the fracking revolution, which in Britain, very typically, we're taking a Luddite attitude to it at the moment, and we're saying, well, no, we can't do that. It might be dangerous. And then in the same breath, this is how ludicrous all this is. In the same breath, they say, of course, we're investing billions in carbon capture and storage, where we drill deep holes underground, we put pipework in, and then we force carbon dioxide down it under enormous pressure. Hello, that is very, very similar to what you do with fracking. Substitute water for CO2, it's the same process. It has the same, in fact, it has more dangers than the fracking does, because if that CO2 farts its way back out again in large quantities, it kills everybody it finds, because in very high concentrations, which is what you'd get if that happened, then CO2 is fatal. Of course, it can be much higher a concentration than we have in the atmosphere now. You can go to 5,000 or 10,000 parts per million, as they do in your submarines, and this is not a problem. But you get a really sudden rush of CO2 that you've tried to force down, and some crack in the rock allows it all back up again. Then you've got problems. And they're perfectly happy to countenance that, while at the same time saying fracking, which has been in use in this country for 60 years and has never killed anyone, is somehow dangerous. This is how feverish and unscientific this entire debate has become, and that's why I say we have to learn the value of doing nothing, because when science has gone as full-on stupid as climate science has, the best thing is not to take any of its advice, to look the other way, tell it to sort its affairs out, and let get on and spend the money where it's needed.
You know, I just as an aside, don't want to be too harsh on the British, but it's odd to me, and it seems to me to be a post-World War II phenomenon, a little bit later here in the United States, post-Watergate in the United States, that countries that were leaders in exploring and, in taking chances are now so reticent to take chances. And even with known technologies, like you say, fracking, and your press over there seems to be much more skeptical than the U.S. press on climate change. At least they're more forthright and more open to publishing skeptical commentaries and such. But at the same time, your government is more reticent to take chances than many other governments. It's just an odd thing to me. I'm not expecting a response. It's something I've noticed over the years, and it's hard to explain.
Well, I mean, I think I can explain it. You see, until my generation, and I was the last row to get this education, we were still taught what was still recognized as a medieval trivium. We started with grammar. We got to know our own language and at least two of the languages of the classical civilizations, sometimes three, sometimes four. We also learned a couple of modern languages, and then that was the grammar. Then we did logic, which meant that we were taught to think straight. And so if somebody came to us and said, there's a consensus, so you have to believe what the consensus believes, we would say, no. Aristotle dismissed that as what the medieval schoolmen were later to call the argumentum ad populum, the head count fallacy, as far back as 2,350 years ago. And so why should we believe anything because there's a consensus about it? They say, but it's a consensus of experts. Well, X, an unknown quantity, spurt a drip under pressure. Fact is that deferring to the authority of experts is another of Aristotle's logical fallacies, and these are the commonest fallacies in human discourse. He listed them in his book, The Refutations of the Sophists being the global warming alarmists of his day. And this book, written 2,350 years ago, spelled out that argument from appeal to authority, the argumentum ad verecundiam, the argument from the reputation of the people who are speaking, that too is a logical fallacy. Then they say, but the Arctic ice is melting, therefore it's all our fault and global warming is terrible. Well, no, the Arctic ice might be melting for other reasons, so that's a non sequitur apart from anything else. And it, too, is the logical fallacy of inappropriately arguing from the particular to the general, which is the argument of accident. And all of these logical fallacies, these bogus forms of argument, we were taught to recognize and avoid them. Now, one of the things the left have done in Britain as elsewhere is they have worked overtime to take logic out of the curriculum. It's no longer there. And in fact, in France, the socialist government actually banned the teaching of logic in schools and universities for many years. Eventually it came back, but they tried very hard to ban it altogether, because once you have been taught at least the elements of the logical fallacies, and particularly if you've been taught how formal logic works, then the kind of sloppy thinking which underlies the way the left approach not only this climate but many other questions can be exposed and seen for what it is. So the left are desperate to suppress the teaching of logic because that allows people to think independently. And it is no longer taught in most British schools. You still get it in the public schools, but in the state schools, of course not. And then the third thing we were taught was rhetoric, which was how to present an argument. Now that you know what language to give it in and how to use the language, now that you know how to think logically and construct a logical argument, how do you put it across effectively? And how do you spot the rhetorical tricks that others will try to use on you? And that's another way of, if you like, it's a form of bullshit detector, so that you can spot when people are using devices and tricks on you. Now, none of these things is any longer taught. These are the three elements of medieval education, and they were taught all the way in Britain in the what we call the public schools, which are of course private schools, all the way until my generation. They were never really taught in the state schools, unfortunately, but they were taught in the private schools, as a result of which our governing class was taken almost exclusively from the private schools while they were given this education, because it meant you could go anywhere in the world and you could approach things with a logical and alert mind that now simply doesn't exist in many cases. And you go into schools and universities, and I'm appalled to find that even eminent professors simply not understanding that the arguments that they are putting forward for climate disaster and doom are not proper arguments at all. Even if there were scientific backing for them, they still aren't proper arguments. They're not arguments for taking any policy decisions at all. So we are going to have to learn from this climate crisis and reform our education system to get back to something much more close to the medieval structure of logic and grammar and rhetoric, those three. And they were, of course, mirrored the three and were intended to nourish the three faculties or powers of the soul. The language was for memory, and then the logic was for the use of reason, which is the central power of the soul, and then the rhetoric was for the will, expressing your own will in your point of view. So you were educating the three faculties of the Christian soul, with these three subjects, one for each of these faculties. There was a symmetry about this, and it all then went back to the Holy Trinity as well. We needn't get too religious about this, but it does have this practical value which has been lost. And so we now get this mushy, sloppy thinking, this emotionalism of which you spoke earlier. And this sloppy thinking is not a good basis for the making of policy.
No, and, my training, you may not know this, Lord Monckton, but my training is as an ethicist. My PhD was in applied philosophy. Of course, I've done a lot of logic. And this is one of the things that I harp on and repeat in my writings is how many logical fallacies, how the arguments just fail on their form. And
how when you try to explain this to people who know no logic, they think you're from outer space. They do not understand a word of what you're saying. And if you sit them down and do the equations for them, using a bit of Boolean algebra, you can eventually get the brighter ones to understand it mechanically. And for the less bright ones, I find that just listing the Aristotelian fallacies and then going through how many of them there are that are applied to the climate by these people, that is quite effective. And in fact, I was having lunch the other day with the editors and senior journalistic staff of the Toronto financial paper. And they were saying to me, we don't think we'd like you to write anything about the climate for us. And so I said, what about the logical fallacies? And I went through those over lunch, and their eyes were like saucers by the end of it. They said, we've never heard any of this before. They said, every single argument that you hear in favor of this climate nonsense is a logical fallacy, regardless of any merits it might otherwise have had. It plainly isn't an argument on which any rational scientific conclusion can be founded. Exactly. I said, that's why I, as a classicist, and you, as a classicist, also an ethicist trained in the same techniques, can see at once, even without having a detailed knowledge of the science, that what is being said to us is wrong. And they were fascinated by that. And I did a piece for them on that, which was hugely popular, because people could then see that there were arguments against this nonsense that were outside the realm of the complicated equations. Now, of course, you and I have also dived into those and wrestled with them because in the end, if they turn around to us and say, but it doesn't matter what your logic says, we say the equations point to this. If we've looked at the equations and we say, no, you've got a mistake here and a mistake there, which is really what our paper in the Chinese Science Bulletin does, then they can't get away with that technique either. What is interesting is that intellectually speaking, the people who are advocating this nonsense, even though they have prevailed politically because the slogan, Save the Planet, is so very attractive, they are losing intellectually and losing comprehensively and getting very angry as they lose.
Let me, we've got to wrap up, but I think there's one really important question left to ask. We could go on forever, I know, but what do you think? If you're our listener, you're sitting in your car heading to work, listening on your iPod or whatever, what's the most important single point you'd like our listeners to take away from this interview concerning the ongoing state of climate science and policy?
I think the most important point is that you can have hope again. You no longer need fear that the industrial activities of humankind are proving disastrous for the planet. They're not, and they're not going to. Cheer up, enjoy the sunshine. If the weather gets warmer, rejoice in the fact that it gets warmer. And use your fossil fuel electricity to generate air conditioning as and where you need it. But stop worrying. The bedwetters have had their day. They were wrong. Cheer up and enjoy.
Lord Monckton, I know you're busy, and we've been very pleased that you could spend so much time with us today. I want to thank you on behalf of myself and our listeners.
Well, it's a real pleasure, and as always, God bless you, and God bless America.
Well, and God bless the UK. Listeners, thanks for checking in with us today. Please check Heartland's website as we follow the progress of energy and environmental laws and regulations that affect you, and the work of Lord Monckton and his fellow climate realists, and go frequently to our Policy Bot site. And
one quick point. Could you tell your listeners to go to SCIBULL, stands for Science Bulletin, scibull.com, click on Most Read Articles, and then download the top article they find. That will be my paper, Why Models Run Hot, Results from an Irreducibly Simple Climate Model. It's number one, and they've been publishing for 60 years, and they have a 60-year archive of scientific papers in the Chinese Science Bulletin. And our paper has had more hits by a factor of 3 than its nearest rival, and that was a paper published in 1992. So there is enormous interest in the subject matter we've written about, which is looking at these huge models from a simpler perspective. And you can help to keep that hit count nice and high by going on to scibull.com and clicking on it to download a copy of our paper and get all your friends to do the same. Let's get the truth out there before it's too late. We have only a few months, or democracy goes worldwide.
I appreciate your interjection there. They can also go to our PolicyBot site, where we've listed your papers since the day it was issued. Our PolicyBot site is your one-stop shop for free market solutions to public policy problems. You just type in Lord Monckton, and his paper, his and his colleagues' paper comes up.